Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live stream special. We've got an interesting show today because if you've been interested in working for a developer, perhaps you've been working with a client, a project director who's a visionary, who's looking at all this stuff, and you thought, maybe one day I would like to do that, or you just want to be a good architect and want to learn more about working efficiently with a developer who's passionate about design, then we have got a really good episode for you because I am joined by the fantastic Russ Edwards here. How are you, Russ? Are you okay?
I'm very well, thanks. Enjoying the Easter period.
Exactly. We might get a little bit of sun soon, and you've got your exciting projects on the way, which I can't wait to learn more about. But before we do that, Russ, while me and you have spoken a bit before, maybe there's one or two people in the audience which haven't met you, not too sure some of the projects you've done. Who knows? But can you first of all introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So Russ Edwards, I'm currently working with Latimer, which is part of Clarion Housing Group. But I trained as an architect, worked in practice for around 10 years, most of that time with DRMM, the Sterling Prize-winning practice, although not when I was there, unfortunately. And then subsequent to that, I spent around 10 years in development roles. So originally in sort of design and technical roles within the development fraternity, and latterly as a project director.
Fair enough. Good for you. Now tell me, so at the start of your career, would you have ever predicted that you'd be now working for a developer when you were studying at university? Was that part of your plans, or was it a case of just going along with the flow and seeing what happened, Russ?
Yeah, it was certainly not part of my plans. I was 100% convicted. I was, convinced I was going to be architect for the rest of my career. Loved actually, the job. I really enjoyed practice. I was fortunate at DRMM. They were a great bunch of people doing fantastic work, and I had a great role within that business. So I led their residential projects for 5 or 6 years. So no, it's safe to say I didn't anticipate anything other than being an architect. And in fact, you can probably push that a lot further back than just my studies. From when I was at secondary school, I always wanted to be an architect. And I guess during practice, a bit as you suggested in the intro, I was fortunate with some of my clients that they started to sort of, I guess, open my mind to the development side and the really positive influence that a good client can have. And I guess the opposite is also true. A bad client can have a very negative impact on a project. And so I guess that's what really started me thinking about crossing over to the client side. It wasn't because I'd fallen out of architecture at all. It was more that I saw opportunities to perhaps have more influence.
That makes complete sense. And do you think as well, it was that passion that you've had for certain particular projects which carry through and was important to you be going to a developer?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was pretty housing specific. I sort of my first I started in architectural practice working on education buildings, but during my time with DRMM, I was asked to take care of their athletes' village project for the 2012 Olympics, and that's my first experience with housing projects. I then went on to work on Battersea Power Station regeneration and also the Elephant and Castle regeneration. And so, urban projects, but really through that work, I started, I guess having a much greater understanding of the housing crisis. And I think my passion around the housing crisis is probably what led me into development more than just design as a sort of driver. I think you can probably track some of my career decisions around scale and influence. And I think client side, you do, you have a lot more influence potentially. You can also influence the design. Do I miss getting my pens out and redlining stuff? Absolutely, I do. But I don't really miss practice, if I'm brutally honest. I do miss the design. I miss the kind of job satisfaction of seeing your projects realized. But I get that
Yes.
same job satisfaction through different channels now. Perhaps a bit more vicariously. But my project that I'm currently working on is over 7,500 homes, and I'm able to directly influence those, hopefully in a positive way. And the reality is I wasn't that as influential when I was in practice.
Well, okay, it makes complete sense. I think what would be useful as well, Russ, is because sometimes when people imagine the role of an architect in a developer, it can vary between people and people. And my experience and what I'm beginning to learn doing these podcasts now is that different developments, different projects is these different roles. What would be awesome is if you can kind of visualize now what you do in the day to day, just so people can understand how this role is different from, as you say before, maybe what you were doing when you were practicing architecture in an architecture practice.
Yeah, so it's probably worth touching on the sort of architect I was before, perhaps coming
Yeah.
into what sort of developer I am. So, you know, most architects need a healthy uh, bit of arrogance, and I'm no different. So I thought I was a good designer, but I wasn't a sort of design architect, as it were. I wasn't an ivory tower or light bulb kind of architect. I was much more, or I became much more delivery focused. So obviously working very closely with the key people in the practice who were leading the design, and then managing the teams and delivering those projects. So always had, I guess, quite a pragmatic approach to architecture and delivery. Um, and so that was quite an easy transition to my early development roles, where I was working in design and technical guidance or management sort of roles. So my first role, development side, was with Pocket Living, the small London-based affordable housing developer, and I was their director of design, and it was a new role created as part of their expansion. And so, portfolio wide, but still delivery, or pragmatic focus, making sure that the brief was being met, all of that kind of stuff. So it was quite an easy transition. And then my next move was to Lendlease, the very large multinational urban regeneration specialist. Much bigger business, much bigger portfolio, but ostensibly very similar role. So design and technical in the residential part of that business, so overseeing the quality of the design work and indeed the delivery aspects of it. So I think that was really quite an easy sort of transition from the sort of architect I was. Very similar sort of skills being used on a day-to-day basis. Quite a different role on a day-to-day basis, but still design team coordination, still in truth, still on using design skills to sort of improve things. But now my role is quite different from that. It has sort of departed quite a lot further from I guess hands-on design issues, and it's much more strategic now. So the the project itself, I'm solely dedicated to this project. It's called Tendering Colchester Borders Garden Community. So we're working on a name for it, but it's a very large new settlement just outside of Colchester. It's pre-planning, so the last 2 years in this role has really been working constructively with local authority partners to shape the policy. So in reality, these are completely new skill sets that I've been developing during that time. I would say I wasn't really a policy wonk in any way prior to this job, but I've learned an awful lot in the past sort of 2 years. A lot of stakeholder management, which I think is part of the architectural sort of practice skill set. but equally, a huge amount of internal governance. And I never learned accountancy skills when I was training. I don't think architects do, but I've had to learn sort of quite a bit of that side, the business planning side as well. So long sort of winded answer, but it's a cliche. What does my day look like? It is genuinely very varied. A lot of as I say, a lot of stakeholder management. So working with councils, working with the local communities, to make sure that we're listening and hearing what's important for them about this project. Still working with designers. We've appointed a fantastic design team through a competition that we held early last year. So we have a team led by Hayworth Tompkins, obviously a very strong award-winning practice, and they're supported by Shalander Hoiberg, a Swedish practice. We have Periscope on landscape. So we've got a fantastic design team which have been working very hard. And I love, I still get my kicks out of sitting in design team meetings and having those sort of qualitative debates with colleagues. But I would say, I don't know, maybe that's 20-25% of my week's time, rather than what it was in practice.
Well, okay, cool. Wow, thank you so much for visualizing that, because I think it's really important. You touched there upon a one part that there was a competition. Hayworth Tompkins won, and congratulations to them. I'm sure they deserved it. You picked them out. However, back before, it might have been you, Russ, as part of that design team for the competition, pitching for the work. And what I'd love to know, now you've been on the other side of the fence, you kind of been the opposite side, seeing the architects pitch for the work. Do you have any tips there or insights? You thought, oh, okay, this would have been good to know back then, or maybe this is some bit the tidbits that you can impart to fellow architects competing for projects?
That's a really good question. Yeah. So I think throughout my time on the development side of the sort of equation, it's something I've given a lot of thought to. When I was with Pocket Living in that first role, we did procure a lot of our work through competition, and yeah, there are definite sort of do's and don'ts. I think some obvious ones are like, read the brief properly. Don't sort of leap to what you think the brief is saying when it's actually asking for something different. And I think that's both in terms of the the building description, if you like, but equally the submission requirements. The amount of times I've had submission requirements that either don't meet the expectations or go way over the top, and actually it's near impossible to read it within the time frames available. That's a definite point. I think really thinking about your audience, I think, is probably one of the best bits of advice I could give. Particularly, are they predominantly architects, or are they predominantly non-architects? The language you use, the kind of graphics that are used, really should be very different depending on who your audience is. And I find that that is a common error. I think architects and building industry professionals will often prepare graphics for themselves rather than for perhaps a more lay audience, and rely on charisma or hot air in the interview to sort of get them over that line. But unless you're really meeting the brief in a submission, you might not even get to that point. I think open competitions in particular are brutal. So we, in our competition for the Garden Community Project, we had 30 submissions. It was an open competition, but it was quite onerous. So it needed a full consultant team, and there was a bit of speculative design work. It was unpaid at stage one. Stage two was subject to an honorarium. But at stage one, so we had 30 submissions, and each submission had, a document ITT, and then a visual piece, and I think there was a video as well, or something of that nature. So and the jury was 6 or 7 of us. We were in a room for a day, and if you just do the math, we were in the room for about 6 hours, 30 submissions. That's not much more than 10 minutes a submission. So the need to really hit your message very early, very boldly, and leave something that the jury remember and strikes the journey, it's super important, and it's very hard. That's why the successful teams at these competitions tend to win more than one at a time. And there is a bit of zeitgeist as well about these things. The imagery can have a sort of be fashionable or trend, have a sort of element of trend about them. But I think that clarity of messaging and really understanding your audience and the process that will be followed to get to a shortlist is really important, and time well spent.
Well, there you go. I think it is useful to hear that perspective. So thank you so much for sharing it. One more along that line, Russ, if you may, because we talked about bidding for the work. However, you also touched upon the fact that you are in the design team meetings, but you're in a different position now than before as well. Do you have any quick top tips on that aspect towards an architect, having now been in your position where you think, maybe it could be added value, maybe it could be things that are not needed, or anything along that thoughts here in your head that you've gone, it would be good to tell the architect this now?
Well, I should caveat this, but this does not apply to my current team. I'm not
No,
going
this
to.
this is top line stuff, nothing to do with the
Yeah.
current project.
What I guess I enjoy being part of the design dialogue, for obvious reasons. So I want to be engaged, and I want to be sort of stimulated in that forum. But what I don't want is my designers to pin up 10 options on the wall and ask me to choose. I want a recommendation or a couple of recommendations. I want to understand the working out. I want to understand the sort of rationale behind a particular approach. But ultimately, we've employed the designers for their skill set, and so I don't want to be the proverbial dog that you buy and then bark yourself. I want our designers to tell us what they think is the right answer. We might not always agree, but I think the fact of being taken on that journey with that working out allows that debate to be a lot more nuanced and sort of knowledgeable. And equally, I mean, the other end of the scale is someone or a sort of design team just presenting one option as a sort of fait accompli, especially early on in the design process, when there's an expectation that all options are on the table and being explored. So getting that balance right is, I think important. And I think, having practiced and then become client side, there is a lot of how can I say this, guff spoken in some design team meetings. There's a great one of my last things as an architect was a plain English course that the practice made us all go on, and it was revolutionary for me to try and cut out all of the kind of unnecessary verbiage in sort of architecture speak, typical architecture speak. So that's another hint.
Yeah. Well, there you go. It is definitely not aimed at the current project. However, really
Definitely
good, very good tidbits here. In fact, no, thank you, because I think that's really, really valuable. One other question I was going to ask, Russ, not to do with that per se, is I know you're passionate about sustainability. It's one of the reasons you're involved in this project, and that's a key thing, the driver and architect. And when we were speaking before, you mentioned, you have your family, you're thinking of the world up and coming, what's it going to be like? So where I'm going with this is you have your personal mission, you have your professional mission, and you're part of a development, body now that's impacting these real lives. So then do you carry that mission into everything you do, Russ? So is it like you constantly have to push that agenda? Is that something you take on board as part of your role, and you think it comes from you? I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, yeah, it's something I constantly struggle with actually. There's a kind of constant
Yeah.
internal dialogue, if you like. So yeah, I mean, I guess the project, just to sort of introduce those ambitions in the project, as part of that competition-winning team that I mentioned earlier on, the sustainability side of the team was really very strong. So the team included Arup, who most of your listeners would have heard of, but
Yeah.
also in partnership with a smaller practice called Exploration Architecture, and their founder is a guy called Michael Paulin, who wrote a really seminal book, or co-wrote, I should say, a really seminal book on sustainability practice, or actually regenerative design practice, called Flourish. And so we're fortunate enough to have Michael on the team. He's kind of broadened certainly my horizons, and I think the projects and the team's horizons around these issues. So
Yeah.
he basically he didn't quite give me a reading list, but he fairly strongly suggested there were some pretty important books to read, which I've followed up, and it has changed the way I think about development, the way I think about certainly new settlement design, but I guess more importantly, how I think about my responsibility very directly, and in particular to my children, but to their children, and so on and so on. So, uh, you know, the project has ambitions to be a a key project in regenerative design terms, and what I mean by that is we're in a sustainability has come to mean doing less bad in overly simplistic terms. Regenerative design is around having a net positive impact on the environment. So, and this project is 25 years at least. And so during that process, we need to reach a point of neutrality and then reach a point where we're having a net positive impact. And so, been thinking a lot about that, what it means for the project, but as I say, what it means for my own family life. And do I have I've rewilded my back garden to be, as a prosaic sort of example of how it's changed things. And I have conversations with my children on a very different footing to how I probably would have had a couple of years ago. And bear in mind, I would have counted myself as being fairly progressive a couple of years ago, but I think the climate crisis has reached such a tipping point that um, you know just sort of ticking along with received logic and sort of doing less bad is not going to get us where we need to be. So, I mean, again, another rambling answer, but it is something that has sort of impacted me deeply. And as you suggest, sort of particularly because I've got kids myself, and I'm really struggling to reconcile what sort of world we might leave future generations unless we get on top of this.
Yeah. So it is important to get on top of it. The other thing is with development, I think it's, of course, projects have to make a profit, right? But there's been varying scales of development, and I guess how much of the design is involved depends on the developer, depends on the project, depends on all this stuff as well. Do you think that your background in architecture has helped those decisions, where sometimes you save certain parts of the design, or now that you've seen things on both sides for us, do you think actually it informs more of your decision now, where you go, well, actually, we can't do everything before this, but and you pick your battles? Has your perspective on that changed now you've seen the full picture compared to before, maybe?
I think it definitely has, and
Yeah.
you might get some different insights from the consultants that I'm working with, whether I'm successful or more positive in that respect. I think it goes sort of two ways. I think I definitely have an understanding of the value that architecture and good design can bring to a project that goes beyond pounds and pence. So I
Yeah.
can try and be a bit of an interpreter with the design team to the people in charge of budgets, for example, in articulating the value case, as I say, beyond the balance sheet. And that's, I think, really important and valuable for our consultant teams. The other end of the spectrum, I think I'm also in a great place to challenge that consultant team around perceptions of what's important, and to sort of articulate to that audience why we might have a different perspective as a developer. What might constitute value from a development perspective rather than a sort of pure design perspective. So I think being the interpreter, if you like, between those two sort of audience is definitely something I can bring to the project, given my background. 100%.
Yeah. No, makes complete sense. I'll be honest here, Russ, as well, because sometimes, as I've told you, well, I worked in architecture before. I have been involved in recruitment, and I used to work with developers as well as architecture practice. And I think that a lot of architects would sometimes really fancy the idea, or they have a bad week, or they've been thinking a while, and they go, right, I've had enough. I want to go to a developer. However, grass isn't always greener, and it's a very tricky role, and it's very different than sometimes people imagine. It's not quite a case of we'll leave architecture designing per se and go on to a higher paid role doing, in-house stuff. It's very, very different. I mean, what would your advice be to someone along that lines? Is it a big commitment actually moving to a developer, something that shouldn't be taken lightly? Is it right for every architect, in your opinion, having seen both sides now?
Yeah, I think it is a big step. I don't know if it's true now, but when I moved across, and that, as I say, that was around 10 years ago,
Yeah.
I very much thought of it as a one-way move. I am aware of some sort of people coming across and sort of going back to practice afterwards, but I certainly felt that it was a one-way door, if you like. I think I'm also lucky in that I had a great time in practice. I really enjoyed my architectural career. And as I say, I didn't leave because I had a bad day, I did have some bad days, don't get me wrong, but that's not why I left practice. I also didn't really leave to chase the work-life balance, although, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't better and a part of the discussion point, but it wasn't a driver. And so I think really thinking about your motive for crossing is important, but yeah, and certainly it's not for everyone, but neither is a practice, frankly. I think I've met a lot of architects when I was in practice that probably would have worked really well client side, and equally I've met some architects who've crossed to client side and it hasn't lived up to their expectations, and as a consequence they're not particularly fulfilled. So yeah, really working through your motive for doing it. I also to, I guess, touch a little bit on my specific journey. I was really fortunate in that I have worked predominantly on development side for clients that I worked for as a consultant prior to leaving practice, and so there was trust there, frankly, from the outset. So my first role with Pocket was for a particular figure who was also really informative in my architectural career. He was my client, my direct client at Battersea Power Station Regeneration, a guy called Nick Williams, and amazing guy. So from the outset, whilst I didn't know what the job would be, I didn't know perhaps what the different challenges would be. I had a kind of mentor, if you like, there day to day, who I trusted, who could help me work through those challenges. And then equally, when I went to work with Lendlease and more recently back to Clarion, has been another client from my time as an architect. He was my client on the Athletes Village. He was my client on Elephant and Castle, a guy called Richard Cook. And so, again, that level of trust and protection, if you like, has been a key part in sort of my decision to come across in the first place. And it's paid dividends. You know, I've no doubt it was the right move for me. So I think that you know, it shouldn't be taken lightly. It needs a lot of thought, and it's not an easy way of improving, I think, things. It's not a sort of get out of jail free card for dissatisfaction in a particular role, I wouldn't say, but it has very different challenges. It has very different benefits. It has very different pain points as well, you know, and frustrations. As I sort of alluded to governance earlier on, you know, governance is very different in an architectural practice to what it is in a large scale development business. And I spend a huge amount of time writing reports and processes which are not pretty to look at, you know, frankly. And so it, you know, the grass is not always greener. It definitely was for me, though.
Wow, it's really, really useful to hear, and I think that really gives an insight into it. I wanted to quickly ask you a question though about. So it's 2024. We're seeing a lot of change at the moment. Some things are the same, but especially in tech, we're talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about all this stuff as well. There's a lot of buzzwords going around, but at the same time, it does seem these things are starting to bleed in, Russ. I just wanted to know your thought on maybe specifically AI or any emerging technologies. Do you think that's starting to come into your world? Are you starting to see it come into the projects, or do you think it's still a long way off, Russ? Or can you start seeing these things getting more and more involved in your projects and your role?
Yeah, I think inevitably it is. You know, we from sort of practical engagements with AI, like, you know, minutes and actions arising from meetings, we're certainly already sort of dabbling in that. We have amongst our Latimer team, we've used some of the AI tools to test our emerging master plans and sort of prepare critiques. I wouldn't say that's a particularly perfect process at the moment, and there's some fairly illogical sort of outcomes from that. But it is provocative, I think it's fair to say. So we're sort of dabbling, I guess. I think we're also, you know, heavily engaged in a sort of digital strategy for the project, which hasn't necessarily looked at AI, but is considering, you know, parametric design and generative design aspects. But I guess the real answer, so I've been with Latimer for 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was with Lendlease, and as I said, in this kind of design and technical role, a little bit more forward-looking, I think it's fair to say, that role. And we were certainly considering AI opportunities in that business. So I guess my point is that we're certainly dabbling. I think there are lots of people out there much more actively considering how this will change our industry for the better. And I would expect some of that stuff to start coming through in the mainstream pretty quickly. My hope is that it can be one of the tool set to improve the sort of resourcing issues with local authority planning teams. You know, can AI have a role in planning determination to lighten the load of officers and enable more nuanced discussion around issues like design with those parties?
Yeah, great. I agree. I mean, I know my business is slightly different, but anything to remove the mundane or and keep the focus on the parts that just involve that thought process, I'm all for on a personal level. The last question I was going to ask from me, Russ, is that it's been a few rough 2 or 3 years for some people. I think it's, you know, since the pandemic, things have been up and down in the construction or design industry. However, I kind of feel like there's a sense things are starting to look like they're going the right way. I was wondering if you're excited for anything. Of course, you've got your amazing project, which is just now starting to materialize. But are you excited for the prospects of 2024 and onwards in construction?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still a few bumps ahead of us, and I think we'd probably be a little bit naive to think otherwise. But
Okay.
there is, I think you're right. There's some growing optimism. I don't want to get into politics, but there's an election looming, and that is generally a good catalyst for new stuff, changing things and moving forward. So I am optimistic, and as you say, our project is at a fantastic point where everything's still possible. So that's hugely exciting. We're working towards a planning submission next year. So the design work between now and then is really really exciting me. And I think another aspect of that is we're working with young people quite a lot to inform the design of that work. And I see, talking about optimism, I see a lot more of that happening in our industry. There's a lot more youth engagement, recognition of the kind of benefits that engaging with young people can bring to a project, and moving away from sort of people that look like me, having a final say on design decisions. So I think that's a really exciting emerging trend, I guess, in our business.
Yeah, I'm all for it. I'm all for it. But what you mean looks like you. Come on, Russ. You're one of the four. You're a trailblazer in your own right. So I really appreciate your candid replies and all that. It's really really insightful. It's not fair that I get to ask all the questions. I'm quite curious if you wanted to ask me anything at all. Could be anything before we close down.
I've got a bit of a two-parter, if I could.
Go on then. Come on.
I guess the first part is, are you seeing more opportunities on the development side for architectural people with architectural skills, or is it seen as something of a luxury during tough times, which I think current sort of market probably is. And then the second part is whether you had any insights into common blind spots for architects looking to cross over. What are they what are the misconceptions that they might have about those opportunities?
Okay, cool. Okay, this would be a good test because this is what I used to get this a lot more, because where I used to work was McDonald and Company, did a lot of real estate recruitment. And so you'd post a role online for a design manager or a project design developer. So the first thing is I learned that the titles are all different depending on the companies. And that's something that people could get tripped up on first. What is a design manager here? What is a technical manager here? It all depends on the developer, and really it was the job description which give away what was needed. So that's the first thing I learned. Then salaries was all open-ended. I think it was more about someone had to come and prove they worth first, and that was the thing. Is, of course, an architect is an extremely valuable skill set, but it's a very different environment. And I think people have to do that jump where it's salary second first. And I think people that would have that attitude would do really well. The other thing that wasn't so obvious to the architect per se is that in a development role, there's very few roles which can be done by an architect only. And what I mean by that is that you could have a very good architect going in for it against a structural person, or RICS tends to do a lot of development roles, so you get a lot of surveyors going for it, sometimes even mechanical engineers. But what I mean is the architect is only one of a few disciplines which can go forward for that role, and therefore you have to know what you're up against. So that's one thing that I learned as well. And I guess the other thing is there would be some misconceptions as well. It's very different. So for example, booking in an interview at a developer with the architect, it could be they just bring the CV. The developer's not necessarily interested in going through the same level of an architecture portfolio. It's more about how big was the project, what did you do, what was your roles, and having that conversation. So it was very, very different, Russ, to going in to you at DRMM, and you'd be going through the candidate's technical drawings in infinite detail. It was just very, very different. And the other thing that I learned is, and it's very different between developers. But for example, there would be certain roles where you had to be at site at 7 a.m. and you had to be there, and it was unglamorous. It was a tin shed in Wembley, and there was I don't want to say no work-life balance, but it was like the role is you're there on site telling the people what to do, and it's dog eat dog, and you got to speak to difficult contractors. Can you do it? So it wasn't as glamorous as some would think. So that's a bit of my insights onto it. It's rough and ready, but if people are up to do the transition, then they normally do well. And the last thing is, it's like you don't always do design in the role. Like, for example, even in your role, you're heavily involved in the design direction, the strategy, but you've brought on Hayworth Tompkins to do it, right? They're leading it, and your role becomes bigger than that. And actually, what I used to say to some people was like, are you sure you want to leave that behind? Because some people think they do, but actually they don't. So that's a few tidbits. Was that useful? I kind of did a bit of a ramble.
I'd add to that last point. I think my experience, this was practice when I was still practicing, was people who had sort of crossed over, and perhaps for the wrong motivation or under illusions that they will be designing, were challenging from both sides. So because they would be frustrated, they would want to design the building, but they're not paid for that, and so you would end up with the worst of sort of both worlds. So yeah, I completely understand that perspective.
You're getting mini flashbacks of that period, I imagine, or isn't it? Or I'm sure as well. But maybe this episode will be good. So if you're being hassled down the pub, Ross, by all your friends in architecture, you can go, I'll give you the tips, but you can check out this episode as well, because we covered a few of the points there. Well, I think that was an extremely valuable episode. I feel like it was. So first of all, thank you so much, Russ, for being here. The last thing I was going to say before you go, if someone wants to get in touch with yourself, learn more about yourself or the Clarion Housing Group, where can they find you? Where do you think they should go to reach out to you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm reasonably active and open for connections, and that's probably the best avenue, to be honest. I'm on X, but I don't tweet, so LinkedIn is probably the best avenue.
Same here. I need to get up my Twitter game, but you can't even call it anymore. That now is Elon Musk's X. But there you go. Thank you so much, Russ. I really appreciate all the stuff, and I can't wait to see your project over the next few years. Maybe we can return to it when it's at a different stage, but what an exciting stage now. And anyways, thank you so much. I'm going to end the live stream right now. Stay on the stage 1 more minute, Russ, while I say thank you to you in the audience as well for being here. I can see a few of you in the background. Maybe you're a bit too shy to ask Russ a question, but that's okay. You can reach out to him and contact, but it's good to know that this was engaging, because I can see the numbers here. More content to come soon, but do connect with Russ. And it's always fantastic when people have gone to development and showcase all the insights which are really valuable to your role as an architect. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the live stream now. Take care, everyone.